The use of steel scrap in steel production saves more than 150 million tons of CO2 emissions every year in Europe alone. However, if the amount of steel scrap used would be increased by another 20%, this could save CO2 emissions equivalent to the CO2 emitted by all the air traffic in Germany, domestic and international. For this to happen, policymakers need to create the right incentives now and should not restrict the free global trade in steel scrap. Steel scrap is not a waste, but a valuable raw material from recycling. Every year in Europe alone, the use of steel scrap saves more than 150 million tons of CO2 emissions. This protects our climate and conserves the resources of our planet. And the best is that steel can be recycled indefinitely without any loss of quality. In 2018, 93.8 million tons of steel scrap were used in the EU, 19 million tons in Germany alone. This represents nearly half of the quantity of raw material required. Every ton of steel scrap that is used saves 1.67 tons of CO2 emissions. For stainless steel scrap, the saving is in fact 4.3 tons of CO2. This means that in 2018, no less than 157 million tons of CO2 were saved in the EU, figures which the Fraunhofer Center for International Management and Knowledge Economy, IMW, has scientifically validated. A 20% increase in the rate of scrap use in European steel production would reduce CO2 emissions by another 31 million tons a year. This is equivalent to compensating for the CO2 emissions of all the domestic and international air traffic in Germany. In spite of these positive environmental and economic effects, the use of scrap has not been sufficiently supported by the existing incentive system put in place by policymakers. The European emissions trading system still has some glaring gaps in it. The use of steel scrap in steel production is not sufficiently rewarded. Key drivers of emissions in the production of primary raw materials have been excluded, such as emissions caused by mines and mining, emissions from the production and transport of raw materials which are imported into the EU. Including these emissions would create fair competition between primary materials and raw materials from recycling. Therefore, we demand policymakers must support the use of scrap. This can be done by stipulating mandatory quotas for scrap. A more market-focused solution would be even better. The use of scrap should be rewarded with financial benefits in the form of free CO2 certificates. This would boost the circular economy and compensate for the existing disadvantages for scrap as a raw material in the medium term. It would give steel scrap the value it deserves. With a current CO2 price of approximately €65 per tonne, contributing to protecting the climate would be rewarded with around €2.1 billion. In addition, the EU shouldn't impede the export of scrap because climate protection is a global endeavour. Steel scrap, a valuable raw material from recycling, for the environment, for the climate, and for the competitiveness of the European steel and stainless steel industry.